we're going to talk to Parag Khanna. He's a global strategist, a political scientist, author, lecturer. He has many titles, so I'm not going to name them all, but he's been a fellow at various research institutes, including Brookings and New America. And his latest book, Move, looks at the powerful global forces that will cause billions of us to move geographically in the coming decades. So Parag, welcome from Singapore.
Thank you so much, Simi. Great to be with you.
Great to have you. So we're going to have a little discussion about mobility at this point. You're in Singapore, which, as we said, is a global city that is thriving, booming. How would you say things have changed there with the pandemic? In the West, you have global cities that essentially people have tried to move out of in the pandemic. What has changed during the pandemic in Singapore, for example?
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for having me join you. And I get very nostalgic watching videos like that opening trailer that showed Tegel Airport. As someone who's sort of Berliner myself, it makes me very nostalgic. So I wish I could have been there in person. So it is very interesting to contrast the discourse around how the pandemic will affect people's geographic decisions and mobility decisions before and after the pandemic in the West versus the East. You hear a lot of people saying in the United States and Canada and Europe that this is, remote work is a great excuse to move away from congested and expensive, core urban cities and, move towards more remote geographies and so forth. But the majority of the human population on this planet does not think like that. Most people in the world live in Asia. And in Asia, the difference in quality of life between urban life and the rest is so vast that people will still continue to flock to cities, to big cities, mega cities. Let's remember that our largest cities in the West, cities like London or Los Angeles, have 12 to 15 million people, whereas Asian megacities have anywhere from 20 to 40 or 50 million people. And young people will continue to go there because you have better access to education, higher wages, healthcare, better internet access, all of those things are in the city. So as a species, we're going to continue to urbanize no matter what the trend is in Western societies. And of course, I'm sure you've been following the latest data as well. The truth is that the population of New York or Los Angeles or London has not collapsed. Right? What we're going to experience, and I think this is so important for our conversation, is a reinvention, a retrofitting, a renewal, an evolution of how the cities as we have them and love them and enjoy them are going to enable a more kind of sustainable mobility and a higher quality of life to keep people in those cities that are very much the engines of innovation.
There is definitely a competition between cities over youth and to draw you to those cities. So who's winning that competition?
And let me say, that's a great question because it's not just a sort of tactical question for, this year or next year. This is like an epochal issue because the world population is actually reaching a plateau. Right? The world population is about 8 billion people and will probably not reach 9 billion people. And fertility levels are so low that today's young generation, millennials, Gen Z, are the largest two generations in human history. And if they're not having children, it means that they are the present and the future, right? They're always going to be, even as they get older, the largest group of people in the world. So where they go does determine the winners and losers. And not just last year and this year and next year, but for the next 10, 20, 30 years. So it truly is a war for talent that will literally be a 30-year war for talent among cities. So therefore, we can't say who will win, in a confident sense, because we also have to take into account a lot of other factors like political stability and, of course, climate change. So cities that are climate resilient, that are more self-sufficient, that offer, clean air and access to fresh water and food and all of these other sorts of, basic amenities, while also being, of course, politically stable and thriving economically, those are going to be the winners. So can we say for sure that it will be Berlin, that it will be Helsinki, that it will be London, or that new cities are going to emerge, or cities that are kind of dark horses and off the beaten track that people are less familiar with are going to really gain in population? We can't be totally sure. In this book, Move, I kind of tour the world and I look at the future of Tokyo from the standpoint of a young person. I spend time in Kazakhstan and look at the thriving young population of Almaty, Kazakhstan. A lot of people probably haven't been there, but I assure you its population 10 years from now will be triple or quadruple what it is right now. And you'll see changes in immigration policy, of course, in Europe. Look at Canada. Canada is the only country in the world that explicitly wants to triple its entire national population over the course of this century, and they're making it easier and easier for young people to come in. Your journey towards citizenship begins the day your plane lands, before you even set foot at a university. So the competition encompasses education and climate and economic opportunity, political stability, and of course culture. Young people want to be in places that have a liberal environment, that are tolerant. So there's so many variables, Sumi, in the calculation, but we do know, and I think I've dropped all these hints, what a city has to do right if it wants to be a winner. So we don't know who exactly the winners will be, but we know what they will have done if they are going to be the winners.
So we know which recipes are working. And from your perspective, you know Berlin well, as you said, you know the US well, you're now in Singapore. What can cities in Europe learn from cities in Asia and some of the cities that you toured for your book?
Well, again, here in Asia, there's obviously been a very different approach to the pandemic. And so there is this sense of communalism, collective solidarity, collective sacrifice. Everyone's wearing a mask, even if they've been vaccinated. Singapore has the highest vaccination rate in the world. You dare not go outside without wearing your mask. You get used to these things that you think of as inconveniences, but really they're not. You're saving people's lives. You check in and check out with your apps. Well, here's one thing. Of course, I appreciate as well as anyone the legacy and concern over political interference through technology or otherwise into the private lives of citizens. However, when you're talking about public benefit, you really do have to step back and have an honest conversation about what sacrifices we should make. And here in Asia, there really has not been much of a debate about that. And it's not because the people are just obedient. It's a long-term pragmatic and collective, sort of conversation and reflection. So simply put, solidarity. And this should not be very hard for Europeans, Sumi. As you know, we're talking about European welfare states that have achieved the highest standard of living for their citizens on average of any countries on the planet Earth. And that is itself the result of solidarity in politics. So why do we not have solidarity today when it comes to simply wearing a mask to protect each other, or using contact tracing apps and things like this? So that's part of it. I'll say one more thing, and this is an area where it's not about learning from one or the other, but it's where both areas of the world are doing things right, and that is adding more green space to cities, reforestation, rewilding, lots of parks, ensuring that public spaces are really livable and freely accessible, and that people can stay cool and shaded in the summer, and those kinds of things, and having free Wi-Fi everywhere. Again, an area where Europe really leads. So I would advocate, that Europe can and should be a lot more confident. When we look at surveys and rankings and studies, and I digest these things all day long, European cities always rank at the top of every survey or study or ranking in the world around quality of life and in the many components of that. So it's about doing those things that Europe has done very well, and not getting overconfident, and not forgetting that one has to keep on investing and nurturing that culture and that infrastructure.
That infrastructure is important. You mentioned green spaces. How can cities continue to expand, grow, and also meet their citizens' needs? So the need for public green spaces or infrastructure.
Well, it's a great question. I think the answer varies just about, a lot. If you compare London and New York, London has per capita, 3 or 4 times more green space than the city of New York, right? So they're equivalent in population, but very different in their design. And then there's cities like Berlin that are incredibly broad. Berlin is, I think, larger than Singapore, the entire country, the island I live on. So, some places are geographically, more capable of expanding. In general, though, and this is a really crucial point when we think about climate change and supply chains and disruption, Here's one thing that cities should not do. We should not be building on the arable land immediately surrounding us, right? Whether it is, the Brandenburger Wald or whether it is, farmland, we need to be using, that green space to actually nourish ourselves, right? We need to reduce the sort of length of supply chains for food and for water. So we need to do more wastewater recycling, we need to do more hydroponic and aquaponic agriculture, all of those sorts of things. And that's something every city also needs to do. And of course, more dense housing. So, if it wasn't clear before the pandemic, it's certainly clear now. We need to convert a lot of our high-rise office towers into affordable housing, right? Allow people to live in, dense communities, but then spend their time out in the public domain. So we can fit more people into the cities that are attractive cities, like Berlin and others, while not necessarily making a trade-off between that and the green space around us. It is definitely not a trade-off, and there are many cities that prove that it's not a trade-off.
For my last question, Parag, I want to pick up on one point you made about not building on important land and to leave open green spaces. We've seen the effect of extreme weather, climate change-induced extreme weather, already hitting many cities also here in Europe now. What needs to be done to adapt for the future, and how can cities connect, perhaps, and ensure that they adapt together?
That's a fantastic question. So just on adaptation, right? And I just want to be clear, because the IPCC report has just come out and it's the talk of the world. It makes clear that our mitigation efforts are wholly insufficient. We have the COP26 summit coming up, which is primarily focused on mitigation, so decarbonization, reducing emissions. Let's be absolutely clear for everyone who's listening now and in the future, our mitigation efforts are not enough. We need to invest a lot more in adaptation. So I'm really glad you used that term. Now, given all of the volatility in the environment and otherwise, the one-word answer to how to adapt, it's to be mobile, right? The theme of this entire, event and conversation. Actually, the punchline of my book is mobility is destiny, because you literally don't know where you will be able to survive and which places are going to be stable, and even if it's environmentally stable, is it politically stable, and so forth. So to be mobile, and that means, therefore, to answer your question, more connectivity among the livable centers, among the cities that are progressive, that are prosperous, that can absorb people, that are functional, that have good infrastructure. So whether it is more railway connections or more, electric jets, flying around, whatever the case may be, we need to have that capacity to move people around to the places where they belong and where they can thrive. So, good infrastructure, adaptation, investments in self-sufficiency, and connectivity between cities is how we're going to enable humanity to be as mobile as it needs to be in the future.
Thank you so much, Parag. Really interesting insights from your book as well, Move, and we're happy to have you joining us from Singapore. We wish you a warm and hearty welcome again here from Berlin, and a good day.
My pleasure. Thank you.